Hi boys and girls, I have a very fun story to read to you today about the weather, since that's what we've been talking about during science time. It's one of my favorite fun weather books. It is Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, and the author is Judy Barrett and the illustrator is Ron Barrett. Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. That does not sound like a typical weather prediction. We were all sitting around the big kitchen table. It was Saturday morning, pancake morning. Mom was squeezing oranges for juice. Henry and I were betting on how many pancakes we each could eat, and Grandpa was doing the flipping. Seconds later, something flew through the air and headed toward the kitchen ceiling and landed on Henry's head. After we realized that the flying object was only a pancake, we all laughed, even Grandpa. Breakfast continued quite uneventfully. All the other pancakes landed in the pan, and all of them were eaten, even the one that landed on Henry. That night, touched off by the pancake incident at breakfast, Grandpa told us the best tall tale bedtime story that he'd ever told us. Across an ocean, over lots of huge bumpy mountains, across 3 hot deserts, and 1 smaller ocean, there lay the tiny town of Chew and Swallow. In most ways, it was very much like any other tiny town. It had a main street lined with stores, houses with trees, and gardens around them. It had a schoolhouse, about 300 people, and some assorted cats and dogs. But there were no food stores in the town of Chew and Swallow. They didn't need any. The sky supplied all the food they could possibly want. The only thing that was really different about Chew and Swallow was its weather. It came 3 times a day, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Everything that everyone ate came from the sky. They didn't have to go to the grocery store. The weather was their food. Whatever the weather served, that was what they ate. But it never rained rain, and it never snowed snow, and it never blew just wind. It rained things like soup and juice. It snowed mashed potatoes and green peas, and sometimes the wind blew in storms of hamburgers. That sounds like a yummy meal to me. Mrs. Dorman would love if I didn't have to go to the grocery store. Ah. The people could watch the weather report on television in the morning, and they would even hear a prediction for the next day's food. When the townspeople went outside, they carried their plates, cups, glasses, forks, spoons, knives, and napkins with them. That way, they would always be prepared for any kind of weather. If there were leftovers, and there usually were, the people took them home and put them in their refrigerators, just in case they got hungry between meals. The menu varied. By the time they woke up in the morning, breakfast was coming down. After a brief shower of orange juice, low clouds of sunny side-up eggs moved in, followed by pieces of toast. Butter and jelly sprinkled down for the toast. And most of the time, it rained milk afterwards. Oh, you know the only thing missing from that breakfast for Mrs. Dorman? Coffee! I need that coffee, right? For lunch one day, frankfurters, already in their rolls, blew in from the northwest at about 5 miles an hour. There were mustard clouds nearby, and then the wind drifted to the east and brought in some baked beans. A drizzle of soda finished off the meal. Dinner one night consisted of lamb chops, becoming heavy at times, with occasional ketchup. Periods of peas and baked potatoes were followed by a gradual clearing, with a wonderful jello setting in the west. The sanitation department of Chew and Swallow had a rather unusual job for a sanitation department. It had to remove the food that fell on the houses and sidewalks and lawns. The workers cleaned things up after every meal and fed all the dogs and cats. Then they emptied some of it into the surrounding oceans for the fish and the turtles and the whales to eat. The rest of the food was put back into the earth so that the soil would be richer for the people's flower gardens. This page wants to stick together. Life for the townspeople was delicious until the weather took a turn for the worse. The headline on that newspaper says, "Spaghetti ties up town." Almost looks like a flood of spaghetti. One day, there was nothing but gorgonzola cheese all day long. Ooh, if you've ever smelled gorgonzola cheese, some people do not think it smells very good. The next day, there was only broccoli, and it was all overcooked. And the next day, there were Brussels sprouts and peanut butter with mayonnaise. Ooh, that does not sound like a great combination. Another day was pea soup fog. No one could see where they were going, and they could barely find the rest of the meal that was stuck in the fog. The food was getting larger and larger, and so were the portions. The people were getting frightened. Violent storms blew up frequently. Awful things were happening. One Tuesday, there was a hurricane of bread and rolls all day long and into the night. There were soft rolls and hard rolls, some with seeds and some without. There was white bread and rye and whole wheat toast. Most of it was larger than they had ever seen bread and rolls before. It was a terrible day. Everyone had to stay home. Oh, that sounds a little familiar, boys and girls. Roofs were damaged, and the sanitation department was beside itself. The mess took the workers 4 days to clean up, and the sea was full of floating rolls. To help out, the people piled up as much of the bread as they could in their backyards. The birds picked at it a bit, but it just stayed there, and it got staler and staler. There was a storm of pancakes one morning and a downpour of maple syrup that nearly flooded the town. A huge pancake covered the school. No one could get it off because of its weight, and they had to close school. How do you think those boys and girls felt about that? I think you probably know a little bit about how those boys and girls were feeling. Lunch one day brought 15-inch drifts of cream cheese and jelly sandwiches. Everyone ate themselves sick, and the day ended with a stomach ache. Oh, they ate too much. There was an awful salt and pepper wind, accompanied by an even worse tomato tornado. People were sneezing themselves silly, choo, and running to avoid the tomatoes. The town was a mess. There were seeds and pulp everywhere. The sanitation department gave up. The job was too big. Everyone feared. They couldn't go outside most of the time. Many of the houses had been badly damaged by giant meatballs. Stores were closed and there was no more school. Oh, how do you think those people are feeling? Boys and girls, this is a pretty silly picture on this one. The noodle was so big it fell on the man's head. Ah. So, a decision was made to abandon the town of Chew and Swallow. Abandon is another word for leave. They decided they needed to leave town. The people glued together the giant pieces of stale bread, sandwich style, with peanut butter. Look how big that bread is. Whoa. They took the absolute necessities with them and they set sail on their rafts for a new land. Look at that, boys and girls. They're using the peanut butter sandwich for a boat. And their sails are pizza and cheese. And I think the flag looks like a piece of bacon. That's a pretty fun boat. After being afloat for a week, they finally reached a small coastal town, which welcomed them. The bread had held up surprisingly well enough for them to build temporary houses for themselves. You can see they built houses out of the bread. The children started up school again, and the adults all tried to find a place for themselves in the new land. The biggest change they had to make was getting used to buying food at the supermarket. They found it odd that the food was kept on shelves, packaged in boxes, cans, and bottles, and meat had to be cooked. It was kept in large refrigerators. Nothing came down from the sky except rain and snow. The clouds above their heads were not made of fried eggs, and no one ever got hit by a hamburger again. And nobody dared go back to the town of Chew and Swallow to find out what happened to it. They were all too afraid. Henry and I were awake until the very end of Grandpa's story that night. I even remember his goodnight kiss. The next morning, we woke up to see snow falling outside our window. We ran downstairs for breakfast and ate it a little faster than usual so that we could go sledding with Grandpa. It's funny, but even as we were sliding down the hill, we thought we saw a giant pat of butter at the top, and we could almost smell mashed potatoes. I think you boys and girls can read this page. The end. All right, boys and girls, that is such a fun story about the weather. Cloudy with a chance of meatballs. I hope you enjoyed it.